I'm the post-lunch entertainment. It's not the most enviable spot for a speaker, particularly when the lights are down, you've had your lunch. But I'll try to keep you at least somewhat engaged before I turn you over to Shai Feldman, who will be the real star of this session. What do I mean by a Cold War? When I talk about the new Middle East Cold War, it's just exactly like the Cold War that you remember. A Cold War is a war in which the protagonists don't fight each other directly. Now, there's plenty of violence in a Cold War, and there might even be violence by one of the protagonists, but the two protagonists don't fight each other directly. And the Middle East Cold War that I'm talking about this afternoon is basically between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, the narrative that has been told to you by most of the presentations today and yesterday is a narrative that begins in late 2010, right? With a fruit vendor in Tunisia who immolates himself, and within weeks, half of the Arab world is up in flames. And that is a profoundly important narrative and the most important narrative, but I'm going to tell you another narrative today. Right? And a narrative that ties into and is tied into this Arab uprising, but is kind of on top of it. It's different. It's the way people in Riyadh and the way, I would argue, people in Tehran view what we're seeing now, and that is through the lens of their own geopolitical competition. Now, Cold Wars, just like the US-Soviet Cold War, Cold Wars are not played out in direct battles between the competitors. They're played out in the domestic politics of other states, in efforts to change the direction of domestic and then foreign policy in other states. And that is what is happening here, right? So a lot of times you'll hear about the Shia crescent or the crescent of crisis, right? Or the crescent of revolution. I think the most important crescent for understanding the regional politics of the Middle East these days is the crescent of weakness, a crescent of weak states. And by weak states, I don't mean states that don't have big armies and couldn't fight a war, right? Kuwait is a very small state. Iraq overran it in less than 24 hours when it invaded in 1990. But I would argue that Kuwait, by my definition, is a strong state, because it has a government that actually governs its society, it controls its borders. It has a population that, while there are certainly political issues within Kuwait, is not particularly divided. They all think of themselves as Kuwaitis. It's hard for foreigners to penetrate into the politics of Kuwaiti society. And so Kuwait is a strong state. Right? The arc of weakness is not really an arc, it's just a bunch of dots. But historically, there have been some very weak states in the Arab world. Lebanon, as we heard earlier. Yemen, very weak central governments for a raft of historical and sociological reasons, right? Weak governments, and when you have weak governments, it's not just that foreigners can intervene in the politics of these countries, it's that local factions invite them to intervene, right? They invite them to intervene in the politics of their country in order to get an advantage over their local rivals, all right? So, there have always been weak states in the Arab world. But what we've seen, right, is a proliferation of weakness in recent years. And this story doesn't begin in 2010. It begins in 2003. When the United States invades Iraq, right, which had been a very nasty but relatively strong state up until around 1990, and then because of foolish decisions that Saddam Hussein made, sanctions placed on it, the state got to be hollowed out in Iraq. And finally, when the United States invaded in 2003 and knocked over what was remaining, we basically destroyed what had been a declining state power, and Iraq became a playing field for other people, into which other people can intervene. Now, Iran had basically the best, they were the best positioned to affect politics in Iraq. One of the reasons is the Sunni Shia thing that we've talked about so much, right? Iran, an overwhelmingly Shia state, has relations with and has ideological affinities with Shia groups in other countries. And so where there are Shia majorities or pluralities, like in Iraq or Bahrain or Lebanon, to a lesser extent Yemen, right? To a much lesser extent, I'll tell you why in a second, Syria. Iran actually has a kind of a natural allies, right? Through which it can try to affect the domestic politics of these states. As the United States project in Iraq fell apart, and it became increasingly clear, right, that Iran was going to emerge as the dominant influence in Iraqi politics, Saudi Arabia started to get worried. Now, the Saudis always worry about Iran, right? We've got the Persian Gulf between them, or if you're in Saudi Arabia, the Arabian Gulf, but we'll call it the Persian Gulf because that's what we Americans do, right? Unless you're in the military. And now everyone in the military calls it the Arabian Gulf because all of our bases are on that side, right? The Saudis started to see, right, the growth of Iranian power as the major threat to their safety and security and their position in the region. So what did they do? They started to try to contest. From about 2005 on, they started to try to contest with Iran for influence in these weak states, in these states where outside powers can easily penetrate because local powers invite them in, right? Lebanon, the Palestinian territories, to a lesser extent Iraq. And the Saudis lost everywhere, right? The Saudis lost everywhere. The Iranians, when we get to 2010, right, have basically bested the Saudis in almost every one of the arenas in which Saudi Arabia has tried to contest with them. So Iran has a very close relationship state to state with Syria, right? When we get to 2010, Syria is in 2010 a stable state, an important player in the region, and has had a strategic relationship with the Iranian regime since 1980, basically, for 30 years. Right? The Saudis have tried occasionally to tug Bashar al-Assad away from Iran, but have failed. Right? The Iranians have an enormously important and influential relationship with the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki. Now, I don't think Nouri al-Maliki, I don't think any national leader wants to be a puppet of a foreign power, right? But if you have to make deals with foreign powers to maintain yourself domestically, you'll do it. And that's what Nouri al-Maliki did after the 2009 Iraqi elections, where he needed Iranian support to emerge as prime minister again. And he did it, besting the Saudi-supported candidate, Iyad Alawi, who headed up the list of a political party in Iraq called the Iraqiyya Party. Right? And Maliki holds on to the prime ministership in Iraq in no small part because Iran backed him. And Iran's clients within Iraq helped him. This is Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah in Lebanon. Right? Hezbollah is probably Iran's closest ideological ally in the Arab world. Right? Shia organization within Lebanon, in essence created by Iran in the chaos after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982. Right? And in Lebanon, Hezbollah has become the dominant, the most important player in Lebanese politics. The Saudis backed Saad al-Hariri, particularly after the assassination of his father, Rafiq al-Hariri, who was former prime minister. The Saudis backed Hariri and Hariri's allies in the Christian community in their lists in Lebanese elections, and actually won 2 Lebanese elections, 2005 and 2009, did very well. And yet, Hezbollah remains the most powerful player in Lebanese politics, despite the fact that the Saudis supported lists won, quote unquote, the elections to the Lebanese parliament. You can understand why the Saudis are a little leery about democracy, right? Their guy in Iraq gets the most seats and he doesn't get to be prime minister, right? Their guys in Lebanon win the most seats, but Hezbollah still runs the show. They have other reasons why they don't like democracy, but you know, you can understand why maybe they're a little hinky about it. The Iranians also have developed a very strong relationship with Hamas, and that's Khalid Mash'al, right? One of the exile leaders of Hamas, not in Gaza, but outside. This proves it's not completely Sunni Shia, right? Palestinians are all Sunni Muslims, the ones that aren't Christians, basically. Khalid Mash'al is not Shia, right? But he's aligned with Iran because of Iran's rejectionist position toward Israel. Now, the Saudis tried to bring Khalid Mash'al, well, not so much Mash'al, but the Hamas faction within the territories in Gaza and the West Bank, together with the Fatah group in the West Bank. And actually, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia negotiated this big agreement between them, the Mecca Agreement in 2007, where Hamas and the PLO, the Fatah, were going to work together. Fell apart in 6 months, right? Every place the Saudis tried to roll the Iranians back, they failed, right? They failed. Then the Arab Spring happens, right? And the Saudis suffer more defeats. Their closest ally in the Arab world was Hosni Mubarak. And Hosni Mubarak goes. The Saudis blame the Americans. The Americans say to the Saudis, what do you expect us to do? It looks like the Saudis are in bad shape. And it looks like the Iranians are doing well. Who falls at the beginning of the Arab Spring? An American ally, Hosni Mubarak, right? Zain al-Abidin bin Ali in Tunisia, another secularist. Right? Another secularist politician. Who's going to do well in these places? Islamists. Well, the Iranians said, this isn't an Arab Spring. This is a Muslim Spring. This is an Islamist Spring. This picture here is a conference that was held in Tehran later in 2011, right? The Arabic is Conference of Youth and Islamic Awakening. Actually, the World Conference of Youth and Islamic Awakening. Word Arab is not present there. These are all Arabs, right? That's Ibrahim al-Jafari, who was the second prime minister of post-Saddam Iraq. Who the Iranians got together to basically say, look, these uprisings that are happening in the Arab world are just a continuation of our revolution. Whose picture looks down on all of them? Ayatollah Khomeini. Right? The Iranians were trying to tell a story that these uprisings in the Arab world are just a continuation of an Islamic revolution which we began. Right? And basically saying, right, our form of politics is now coming to the fore, and we are going to be the big power in the region. Right? And if you had any doubts about that, ask General Qasem Soleimani, right, who is head of the Quds Force. And the Quds Force is that part of the Islamic Republican Guard Corps in Iran that deals with overseas activities, right? So Iran thought, especially at the beginning of the Arab Spring, that it had the whip hand, right? And in their contest, their regional contest for influence with the Saudis were losing and Iran was winning even more. So what do the Saudis do? They push back. The first place they push back is within their own area of Bahrain, within the Gulf, right? This is the Pearl Roundabout. This was the center of the Bahraini uprising. Bahrain is this little island, right here off the coast of Saudi Arabia. It's connected to Saudi Arabia by a causeway. The population of Bahrain is about half foreign, about half local, as opposed to, say, Qatar, which is about 90% foreign and 10% local. Of the local population, probably 2/3, maybe 60% are Shia Muslims, and about 40%, 1/3 in there, Sunni Muslims. But the government of Bahrain, the ruling family of Bahrain, are Sunni Muslims, and they're closely allied with the other monarchical regimes, Sunni monarchical regimes in the region, and particularly with Riyadh. All right. Pearl Roundabout. Huge protests. Mark Lynch mentioned an enormous percentage of the citizen population of Bahrain actually in the streets, an unprecedented amount probably, percentage-wise, of Bahrainis in the streets compared to any other part of the Arab world, protesting, calling for political reform. Some calling for the overthrow of the monarchy, but most calling for political reform. Right? It's hard to see, but in this picture, in the carnival atmosphere of Pearl Roundabout in the couple weeks I was there, in English, it's written in the sand there, peaceful protest. Peaceful protest, and it was. It was a peaceful protest. For a number of reasons that I don't want to bore you with, having to do with internal politics and the family that ruled Bahrain and all, any effort at a political solution was curtailed. The Saudis sent in troops to back up the Bahraini Defense Force, and this is what the Pearl Roundabout looked like, right, after the protests were squashed. And the symbol of the Pearl Roundabout, this pearl, the Gulf pearls, Persian Gulf pearls, was destroyed by the regime. Right? The Saudis were pushing back. They were not going to allow a monarchy to fall, and they were certainly not going to allow a Shia majority country to get rid of its Sunni monarchy and become democratic, because what would happen then? Well, the same thing that happened in Iraq. Right? The Shia would elect a Shia government and it would ally with Iran. And the Saudis said, we are not going to allow that to happen. The other thing the Saudis did is provide political and to some extent economic support, more promises than actual money, to other monarchs, to the King of Jordan, less so to the King of Morocco. He seemed to be pretty much in control of his situation. To the Sultan of Oman, a country that we don't hear much about in the Arab Spring, but did experience some significant, although not regime-threatening, demonstrations during this period. So the Saudis were trying to consolidate their areas, fellow monarchs and their Gulf allies, and Bahrain was both. That's what in social science we call overdetermined, right? There are all sorts of reasons the Saudis weren't going to let the Bahraini monarchy fall, right? But still, it looked like the Arab Spring was going to turn into an advantage for the Iranians in this Middle East Cold War. Until Syria blew. And when Syria blows, the Saudis have an opportunity to roll back Iranian influence. Really the first opportunity they've had to roll back Iranian influence. And so they went all in. But the Saudis aren't the only important regional player here. Let's go back to the map. The country with the second longest border with Syria is Turkey. A country who would be affected by refugee flows, a country who would be affected by political upheaval in Syria is Turkey. And this is a Turkish government now that for the last 5 or 6 years preceding the Arab Spring has begun to take a much more activist role in the politics of the Arab world, in regional politics in general, after decades of basically avoiding the Arab world and focusing its foreign policy toward Europe. Very quickly, the Turks and the Saudis get on roughly the same page. They want to see Assad go. Right? Now, this is interesting because in both cases, there were happier days. Right? As I said, on numerous occasions, King Abdullah tried to cajole Bashar al-Assad away from the Iranians. Right? You're an Arab. What are you doing with these Persians? We can help you out. Remember the good old days when your father was in power and we had such a good relationship. Of course, Bashar would then say back, but my father had a really good relationship with the Iranians too. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the prime minister of Turkey, also tried to cultivate Assad, right? Established friendly personal relations with him, right? Their families would vacation together on occasion. Bashar and his lovely British educated wife, and Mrs. Erdogan wearing her hijab, right? Erdogan felt betrayed by Bashar and quickly kind of jettisoned him So the happier days, right, also ended between the Turkish government and the Syrian government. And thus Syria becomes the test, right, of Saudi Arabia's ability to roll back Iranian influence in the region. That's why the Saudis have gone all in on change in Syria. Right? The Turks are not all in, right? Because unlike the Saudis, they actually have a border with Syria. And they are reluctant to use their superior military power to affect, at least so far, they're reluctant to use their superior military power to affect the direction of Syrian politics for the same kind of fears that Josh was talking about America feeling about getting involved in Syria. They don't want to be sucked in. They want to see regime change, but they want the war to stay cold too. The question is, how long can that last? How long can that last, given the fact that unlike Saudi Arabia, Turkey actually feels the negative effects of the fighting in Syria very, very directly. If you are in Riyadh, or if you are in Tehran, the lens through which you view the upheavals of the Arab Spring, right, is not the lens of democratization. It's not the lens of people reclaiming a role in their government. Right? It's through this lens of weakness that I mentioned before. Right? What new arenas are opening up in which we have to be involved in order to check the other guys or roll back the other guys or advance our interests vis-a-vis the other guys? And now not only do we have Lebanon and Palestine, the Palestinian territories, and Iraq, and to a lesser extent, Yemen, and maybe Bahrain, but now we have Syria joining that arc of weakness. Right? As the Syrian government's ability to control its territory, its ability to provide services, its ability to govern, right, is chopped away at by this civil war. So it's not a Shia arc. It's not an arc of crisis. It's an arc of weakness that draws these foreign regional powers into the game. And that, I think, is the narrative that defines how the Saudis, how the Iranians, and I would say increasingly maybe how the Turks are viewing this. Right? The Turks saw themselves, if the Iranians saw themselves as a model, the Turks also saw themselves as a model. Right? For the Tunisians, for the Egyptians, even for the Libyans after a little hesitation because there were a lot of Turkish companies working for Gaddafi in Libya. Putting themselves forward as a moderate, democratically elected Islamist government. And frankly, that is a good model. Right? I think it was a very attractive model to many of the Muslim Brotherhood types in Tunisia and Egypt. Right? But now the price for Turkey is not low, because it's its own, it's a country on its own border that's blowing up. So while I would argue, again, that the narrative that we've heard so far, right, that begins in late 2010, right, and it's all about people trying to reclaim some role in their government is the most important narrative, it's not the only important lens through which we have to view the events of the last few years if we want to understand how things are developing in the region. I tried to give Josh this slide. This is Syrian ethno-religious groups, right? They have Arab Sunni as 60%, maybe it's 70%. But since Josh did such a good job and such an optimistic job at talking to us about Syria earlier, I decided I wouldn't spend too much time on this. Right? Suffice it to say that the cleavages within Syria, as Josh described, are as serious, although not the same, as the cleavages within Lebanon, the cleavages within Iraq socially. But it's not just social cleavage that defines the ability of outsiders to intervene in politics. It's also that weakness of the centralized state, right? Bahrain has a nasty state, but it's strong. And it's preventing outsiders, or what it sees as outsiders, from intervening. And it's doing that by repressing its own people. How long that can last? Open question. But that That's the dynamic there. I just want to mention one thing. While we were at lunch, somebody mentioned, well, who are these Alawis? You know, these Arab Alawis, 12%. I'm going to steal Landis's thunder for just 30 seconds and give you the full history of the Alawi sect in 30 seconds, okay? This is a heretical offshoot of Shi'ism, right? That mixes together in a syncretic way kind of pagan, Christian, and Shia Muslim elements, right? It stems from the Shia veneration of Ali, the son-in-law and cousin of the Prophet, who the Shia saw as the first legitimate, the legitimate line of leadership after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Alawis even go beyond other Shia in their kind of veneration of Ali. But it's become a kind of a very, as happens when you go up into, when you're a heretical sect and you go up into the mountains, your ideas become kind of inbred and kind of weird. And you know, going into theology of it is not my job, and I couldn't do it that well. Ask Josh about all that. But when we talk about Alawis, that's what we mean. They're a sectarian group, as opposed to, say, Kurds, right, who are an ethnic group, right? The Kurds are not Arabs, they're not Persians, they're not Turks. They have their own language, they're an ethnic group. But Alawis are a sectarian group, right, within Syria. The new Middle East Cold War. Is history repeating itself? I always put that in for audiences of a certain age that might remember back more than a couple of years to earlier periods in the Middle East. And looking out at you, even with the lights down, I think you qualify for that. How many of you remember this guy? Right? Put your hands up if you remember him. Even if you're at a remote location, put your hands up. I can't see you, but other people can. This is Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was the president of Egypt in the 1950s and 1960s. He was the most important figure in the old Arab Cold War, right? Where state weakness invited foreign powers to intervene. When Abdel Nasser, who was the epitome and leader of the Arab nationalist movement, could appeal ideologically across his borders through a new technology called transistor radios, right? He could appeal to people across borders to rally to him and oppose their own governments. In the weak, ungoverned areas of the Middle East, where the state was weak, society was not under its control, Nasser was able to mobilize people to his side. And his opponents also intervened in places to fight against him and try to check his influence, right? I'm a teacher, so I'm going to give you a reading assignment. If you really want to understand the regional politics of the Middle East these days, read two books. Neither one of them was published anytime recently. The Arab Cold War by the late Malcolm Kerr, former president, assassinated president of the American University of Beirut, tells the story of the first regional Cold War, which I think is really very similar to this one. Right? Read about how Nasser tried to dominate the region, and read about how he failed. What was one of the major areas of this Arab Cold War? Well, your second reading assignment is a book called The Struggle for Syria by Patrick Seal. Right? This is a book that talks about Syrian politics from 1948-49 up until around 1958, when Syria was the main arena in which the Arab Cold War was fought out. Right? The names have changed, but the dynamics are very similar. And my concluding thought here is, because the dynamics are so similar, we can learn not only about what's happening now, but we can learn maybe not to be so afraid of it. Because if Gamal Abdel Nasser, the most popular man in the Arab world, could not dominate this region, I'm not really sure the Iranians could dominate it today. Thank you.
Greg, another fascinating lecture. Thank you. I want to begin where you left off, because you got a lot more to say. How does this Cold War play forward? If your thesis is that Iran can't dominate, Iran is still a powerful state. It's aligned with the Alawites right now, with Hezbollah, and with Hamas. And Iran is a very powerful governmental apparatus. So in the next 5 to 10 years, how does the Cold War play out? And the Saudis are weakening in one sense. They're going to have a leadership transition/crisis. So what's the probability that Iran stays slightly more powerful, at least for the next few years?
I'd say that it's relatively good, but I also think that the chances of Iran becoming a dominant power in the Middle East are very, very low. Remember, the United States is still very, very close to the most powerful military force in the Middle East, and that's Israel, right? What was the final coup de grace to Nasser's hegemonic play in the Middle East was his defeat in the 1967 war. The United States has a NATO ally in Turkey. And the Turks, I think, are increasingly looking at Iran and the rise of Iranian power as something that they would like to check. And the United States still has a close relationship with the wealthiest country in the Middle East, and that's Saudi Arabia. So it seems to me that even though the Saudis have problems, the Iranians have their own issues too. I mean, they're going to have an election. Who knows what the new presidency is going to look like, right? The supreme leader is not as old as King Abdullah, but he's not a spring chicken either. So it seems to me that I think that we can be much more, we in the United States can be much more sanguine about the quote-unquote threat that Iran poses in the region, because I think that there are plenty of regional forces that array against it.
So if that's true, that's your position, obviously. Does that inform your view of how much we should worry about Iran's acquisition of a nuclear weapon? And what would your advice be to the president? Do we fight the Iranians now? Do we negotiate first and take part in this Cold War to limit their influence? How do you see that?
Well, we're involved in this Cold War. There's no question about that, right? We've been involved in a Cold War with the Iranians for 30 years now. There's a recent book called The Twilight War, which kind of tells that 30-year story of the struggle between Iran and the United States, not just in the Middle East, but in other places. Look, I have a very minoritarian view of this thing. I don't think Iran with a nuclear weapon makes any difference, changes anything in the Middle East, because you can't use it. Now, that view is not shared by most people. And because it's not shared by lots of people in the Middle East, and they don't listen to me, it might lead to reactions from either us or the Israelis or other people. But I frankly don't see this. It gets back to this idea of a Cold War. Iran's strength is not its military, right? It's not conquering Lebanon. It's not conquering Syria, and it's not going to conquer Bahrain, right? The root of Iranian strength is its ability to, through both its ideological message and through material support, to support allies in weak Arab states. Whether it has a nuclear weapon or not, I would argue, is almost irrelevant to that equation. And so I frankly don't see the nuclear issue as all that important. But I also recognize that I'm one of the few people who thinks that.
And just very quickly, because this is a really important issue for the United States, President Obama said in a speech last year to AIPAC, March 2012, one of the problems with Iran going nuclear is that other Arab states or other states in the region might then choose to become nuclear weapons power, and all of a sudden you've got multiple powers in the most combustible region. He didn't name them, but I would think he was thinking about Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt. Right. You know the Saudis well and the Turks. Would they go nuclear if Iran does?
Well, it seems to me that Turkey's a member of NATO and could very plausibly say that we don't need to. We don't need to take on the headaches. We have an alliance with nuclear powers. The Saudis are more complicated. I would say that there will be serious discussions, as there already are in Saudi Arabia, about how to react to a nuclear Iran. I think that we have enough influence in Saudi Arabia, that we can persuade them that the costs of going nuclear are greater than the benefits that they would achieve. Now, that's a judgment on my part. There are other people who think otherwise. I think it will be a close-run thing in Saudi. I think one of the reasons for maintaining the close relationship in Riyadh is to have that leverage to, if it does happen, that when they make that decision, that we have a seat at the table.
Thank you. A question up here in the balcony, yes.
Kyle Shank from College of the Atlantic. First and foremost, thank you for being here. And secondly, more people probably subscribe to your minoritarian view than you would think do. But my question is along the lines of...
You should run for Congress.
10 years. My question runs along the line of your Cold War analogy. Yeah. Do you see that the possible outcome of this could be the Balkanization of the Middle East? Splitting these countries along sectarian and ethnic lines, for example, amongst the Kurds? Right.
You know, we're talking about the redrawing of the borders of the Middle East earlier today. It's already happened, right? This is not a hypothetical. The Kurdish regional government in northern Iraq is a de facto independent actor in the region. It has its own army, it has its own government, it has its own foreign policy. It signs oil deals with international oil companies without the permission of Baghdad. It's remaining within the legal structure of the Iraqi state is purely a matter of convenience and prudence. The map has already been redrawn. Now, whether it's going to be redrawn in Syria or not, it's an open question. I would say no. I just don't think that a retreating Assad regime could sustain itself. But I might be wrong. Josh knows more about this than I do, and he thinks it's a possibility. So it's out there. But look, the territorial integrity of the Middle East as we knew it in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s has already broken up. Whether it continues to break up is, I would bet no, but I don't have a whole lot of confidence in that bet.
I think we have a question from one of our remote locations. This is from Nathan Rockwood in Ellsworth. How does the Syrian-Iranian partnership affect the state of Israel?
Well, I think that the most important thing in terms of Israeli security is how the Syrian-Iranian partnership plays into Lebanon and plays into Iranian support for Hezbollah, Syria being the conduit for Iranian supply of arms to Hezbollah, and its political connection, right? I mean, Hezbollah has a secure hinterland in Assad's Syria, and that allowed them to breathe a little bit politically and allowed the Iranians to engage them very directly through Syria. Look, the Assad regime had a really good relationship with Israel in many ways. The most important of which was they knew the red lines, right? And the border, after the 1967 war, and after the 1973 war, particularly when the ceasefire lines were drawn and the UN was put up there, that border has been incredibly quiet. And thus, the desire by many people in Israel and in the United States and in Saudi Arabia and other places to see a rollback of Iranian influence and the replacement of the Assad regime in Damascus also then opens up a new strategic dilemma for the Israelis. Would a new government in Damascus maintain that stability on the border that the Assad regime had? Right? If we think back before the Assad regime, when Syria was, as Josh said, a banana republic, although the clothes weren't nearly as nice as banana republic, right? When Syria was subjected to enormous amounts of political instability, one way the governments tried to curry public favor was by taking hardline positions on Israel. One could argue that the whole dynamic of the 1967 war began because a weak Syrian government was looking to provoke and prod the Israelis, right? A return to that kind of situation, I'm not sure strengthens Israeli security.
Thank you. Another question in the balcony. Yes.
Hi. My question is, don't you think, or would you say it's valid that we tend to group or to judge Iran's alliance with Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria, for example, to be terroristic, even if we don't use the word to describe it, but we tend to portray US's alliance with Israel as if it's legitimate or as if it's the Arabs and the Muslims that left them no choice but to attack and invade?
Wow. Now, I never use the word terrorism in my talk. We can, put whatever labels on Hezbollah or Hamas we want for political reasons. Hezbollah and Hamas are sub-state actors, right, that use violence, right, just as many states use violence, right? We can draw our own moral judgments about them, and I think everybody does. That's fine, right? As an analyst, right, I'm just trying to understand the dynamics that have led to the current configuration in the region. And that's why I emphasize state weakness, right? The only reason that we talk about a Hamas or a Hezbollah as major players is because the Lebanese state, right, the nascent proto-Palestinian state, are weak entities, right? And thus sub-state actors can, in essence, pursue their own policies, right? Pursue their own foreign policies of making alliances with foreign powers. I think that the United States, the United States has alliances with sub-state actors too, right? We deal with sub-state actors in Lebanon. We're dealing with sub-state actors in Syria right now, right? So I try not to think of this too much in terms of moral judgments. I think everyone can make their own judgments about what they think about Hamas, what they think about Hezbollah, what they think about American policy. To me, they're all players in the game.
And where you stand is where you sit.
And I'm sitting right here, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
And from my perspective, I just feel compelled to say this. From an American government perspective, it was Hezbollah who bombed our embassy in Beirut and killed Americans. Hezbollah who bombed the Marine barracks and killed 240 Marines. Likely Hezbollah and Iran who killed Malcolm Kerr on January 18th, 1984 in Beirut. So from an American perspective, particularly a governmental perspective, these are terrorist groups. That's a charged statement, but I think it's an accurate one. So we have time for
There's certainly anti-American groups.
Right. One more question right here.
Ward Wickwire, Lincolnville, Maine. Could you comment on the U.S. efforts to affect things in Iran with respect to the stick of sanctions versus the possible carrot of expanded commercial relationships, educational relationships, and so on?
Well, Sayed Hussein will discuss the U.S.-Iranian relationship in great detail later on this afternoon. I think that on both sides of the U.S.-Iranian equation, there are real obstacles to any kind of return to a normalized relationship. I think there are domestic political obstacles in Iran that might actually be greater than those in the United States. I do think that there's the possibility of limited agreements, hopefully even on nuclear issues that could satisfy both sides. But I'm very, very reluctant to say that I think there's a chance for a return to normal, regular, decent relations anytime soon.
We're going to bring Greg back tomorrow. Tomorrow, after Barbara Ibrahim speaks and after Larry Pope speaks, Larry and Barbara will be joined by Josh and Greg and Shai, and I'm probably leaving someone out, but a couple of others. And we'll have Syed Hussein, excuse me, will be here. And we'll have 90 minutes to revisit all these issues and in the break as well. So Greg, thank you very much
My pleasure.
for being with us. Thanks. Good job.